My name's Dave Bookless, and I've recently written a book called God Doesn't Do Waste. It's not an easy book to sum up because it's more than one thing. Partly, it's the story of how my wife and I and our family felt called to move out of what we were doing. I was a vicar of an ordinary church in a very multiracial part of London, and God called us out of that to set up an environmental charity, A Rocha UK, and gave us a vision that a piece of land that had been neglected for more than 30 years and was full of rubbish could be transformed into a nature reserve and a country park. And that's partly where the title comes from, that God doesn't do waste in terms of this messed up place. God gave us a vision of the healing of the land, that this piece of land could be restored and redeemed to his glory, and so that local people could have a really good place to use. But the book's more than that. It's a bit of an autobiography because it starts with my own story, born into a missionary family in India, spending 10 years there and moving from place to place to place to place, both in India and then when we came back to the UK. Feeling very rootless, very disconnected from any particular place, feeling quite hard to make friendships because I kept on being uprooted. It goes through tough times in my life and that of my wife as well once I'd met her. So it talks about being bullied as a teenager. It talks about repeated miscarriages that we suffered soon after our marriage. It talks about times of real sickness, severe illness and disability that my wife went through, and of mental illness as well, of depression. And it asks all the questions that people normally have, Christians and others in those situations. Where is God? Why is God allowing this to happen? Why aren't I being healed? And one of the themes that comes through in all of these experiences is that God doesn't do waste. That the terrible experiences that we happen, which we experience, which God doesn't ever send, but God can use them. God can turn them around and can recycle them, can redeem them into something that's really good for his purpose. As I've written the book, I've had specific audiences in mind. I've wanted it to be something that my older children, who are now teenagers, can understand and relate to. I wanted it to be a book that people in my church, it's a very multiracial, very working class church where most people don't read many books, if any, certainly don't read theology. But it's full of stories, it's full of experiences. There are funny moments and sad moments in there. And it's really a book that explores big issues, like living in a multi-faith town with a belief in Jesus as the only way to God, like living with a belief in a God who heals, but with a wife who's heavily disabled and wasn't being healed for much of the time, like believing in a God who wants us to care for creation when so often the church doesn't seem to be bothered about that. So it wrestles with those issues, but through stories and through examples rather than through heavy theology. And the other group of people I've had in mind as writing the book are my non-Christian friends locally, parents down at the primary school where our kids go and teachers at that school, people who we meet in the supermarket here in Southall, people from Sikh, Hindu or just secular backgrounds who kind of wonder what makes us tick. And that's really at the heart of this book. It's what makes me tick as a Christian. A belief in a God who takes the very ordinary things of an ordinary person's life, the bad experiences and the good, and can transform them by his glory into something that really glorifies him, something that's good for his purposes. God doesn't do waste.